Welcome to Building Static Measures. In this lesson, we'll review how to create a static measure, but before we jump into creating a static measure, let's take a moment to review a little theory about this measure type. Static measures are measures with a static temporal structure, meaning a temporal structure that has no relationship to time. So, measures created with a static temporal structure are simply lists of observations. The primary use case for static measures is to enable the validation of objects by analytics portal users. We'll quickly review this measure, count of ED visits, to explore the presentation of measures with a static temporal structure. In contrast to measures utilizing other temporal structures, which are displayed as run charts, static measures are rendered as bar charts. This is because they lack a defined relationship to time. However, you can still split and filter the measure results as desired. Static measures' denominators are always equal to 1. The measure's numerator is simply the count of records in the object or the objects that are linked together in the numerator stack. Like measures utilizing the event temporal structure, static measures do not distinguish between observations and cases. When creating measures with this type of temporal structure, an observation is the same as a case. It's also worth noting that because static measures have no relationship to time, the concept of reporting segments, or how observations are assigned to reporting periods, does not apply. Let's go to Measure Workshop to create a static measure. We'll start by selecting the plus sign icon in the upper right corner of the screen. You'll be redirected to the New Measure screen, where you can select the Count of Object N Records template to create a new static measure. As you know, once you select the template, the associated form appears and you can start specifying the measure. This form is very simple because the measure we're specifying is very simple. First, you'll specify object N. Again, because the denominator for static measures is always equal to 1, the object is considered a numerator object. We're going to select the claims-based ED visits object that we've used before. As you may remember, the case ID is the field or combination of fields that identifies unique records in the object. In this case, Ursa Studio inferred correctly that the case ID is encounter ID. The measure name is auto-generated as count of instances of SO Ursa claims-based ED visits. But we can modify this in just a moment in the Measure Properties screen. Next, we'll specify the measure's nickname. Here we can use count of ED visits, and as a reminder, measure nicknames can be no more than 50 characters long. Now we can specify the measure identifier. The measure identifier is meant to be short and easy to recognize. We'll use ED-V01 to indicate this measure is associated with emergency department measures and is used for validation purposes. Finally, select the measure domain or the measure's category. As this type of measure is generally associated with object validation, we'll select that option. Now we have the opportunity to preview the measure's specifications before we create it. After completing the template, we're redirected to the Measure Properties windows. It's fairly standard with static measures to use the measure's nickname for its name and description, and then we'll confirm the measure name is correct as it was initially auto-generated by the system by clicking the check mark. Before we save this measure, let's take a brief tour of a couple of the key panels. We'll start with the Published Fields panel that's associated with the numerator base object. We're checking to see if all of the fields that we want published with the measure are selected, and that all of the fields we want to designate as analytic fields are also checked. Now these fields can be split in Analytics Portal. Now let's take a look at the Configuration panel. All of these options were reviewed in previous lessons, but there are a couple of things worth noting. First, the Count Measure option is selected, which is why this measure only has a numerator stack. The designation of Count Measure is also why the Component Class option is not presented. As you probably remember, the component class is how we specify whether a denominator observation has, at most, a one-to-one or a one-to-many relationship to numerator observations. The measure's temporal structure is specified as static, and the case ID is set to encounter ID. While this measure does not have the dominant case option, which is found in measures with denominator and numerator stacks, and enables the specification of what the stack's end users are most likely to consider the measure's case, we know that this measure's dominant case is the numerator because it's a count measure. As such, we need to specify the ranking field. We can use the nb.ed visit start date for this option and set the ranking direction to descending so that the most recent visits are listed first. This review of configuration parameters highlights that the template helps to fill all of the necessary specifications. The Numerator and Denominator Contributions panel enables you to specify how the measure's numerator and denominator are calculated. The numerator contribution counts the value 1 for every record in the object. As this is a count measure, the denominator contribution counts 1 for every case in the denominator object. As there is no denominator object associated with the measure, the denominator is 1. Lastly, we'll quickly look at a few options in the Measure Metadata panel. Static measures use the Poisson distribution, and by default have a measure precision of 1. The Measure Range option is set to count, and the measure unit is set to number. If you were creating a static measure without a template, these are the metadata options you would want to select. However, when you create a static measure using the Count of Object and Records template, all of these options are set for you. Now we can go ahead and save this measure. From here, you can add this measure to a report and then run the report to view the measure in Analytics Portal. We reviewed that process in a previous lesson, so we won't go through that here. That's all for this lesson. You now know how to create a static measure, as well as some of the core configuration options related to the construction of static measures. Thank you for your time, and I'll catch you in the next lesson.